What's going on, everybody? Nathan here, back again with another deck tech. This time we are taking a look at the Pauper EDH format, otherwise known as PEDH. Pauper EDH is a little bit different in that all of the cards in your 99 must be at the common rarity, and your commander can be any uncommon within your chosen color identity. These decks tend to be very cheap because of how inexpensive the commons are. In fact, this deck only clocks in at around $22 using TCG player market prices, and this particular deck is focused on cascading out a lot of big booties onto the battlefield and swinging for a lot of damage. This is at its core a Simic value pile, however it is not focused on infinite combos, and it is not messing with any landfall shenanigans. The reason why I say that is that one of the most popular decks in the format is helmed by Tatiova Benthic Druid, and it is just a very, very fast deck. This deck is similar in concept. It really is aiming to ramp out big monsters. A quick disclaimer, because I don't usually cover PEDH, there's a couple of rule changes. So in PEDH, your life total starts at 30 and it takes 16 commander damage to knock somebody out with commander damage. In that way, our fatties are actually a little bit more powered up compared to a normal commander match where stats don't necessarily matter. One of the reasons why I've been messing with PEDH recently is because it gives you that feeling of old school commander where it's not like everybody's doing everything all at once, racing these fast Ferraris to the racetrack and trying to see who beats each other first. Rather, this is sort of, I just like the feel that this brings you back to the old days of playing just kitchen table commander where the cards are a lot more lower power, and aside from infinite combos and competitive Pauper EDH, which there is a CPDH meta out there, you can have a lot of fun just actually crashing 7/7s into each other. Let's delve into the deck then, but before we get into the individual card discussion, I'd like to ask, if you enjoy this type of content, please leave a rating on this video, and if you like this sort of content, then subscribe, because I will be making more of it in the future. I have one other Pauper EDH deck to cover before we will go back to normal commander. So with that out of the way, let's dive into the macro statistics for just a moment. So if we hop on over to Moxfield, our average CMC of the deck is 3.9. In our land analysis, we're running 10 tapped lands and 27 untapped lands. Now, the reason why I mention the CMC is that Pauper tends to be a bit of a slower format, and so one of my favorite ways to play draft, actually, which transfers over to Pauper EDH, is that I like having a pretty big top end to ensure that I'm never drawing into dead draws in the late game. And Imoti really helps us to take advantage of that. In fact, with her ability here, so she has Cascade, and it says spells you cast with CMC 6 or greater have Cascade. So when we take a look at our mana curve, we're pretty high on the 6 CMC slot. In fact, if I hop over to Moxfield to take a look at what our actual creatures are, the only creatures we're running that are larger than 6 CMC is Annoyed Altasaur, which has its own Cascade trigger for additional advantage. Greater Sandworm, which has a cycling ability, so if we don't need it in the early game, we can cycle it. Striped Riverwinder for the same reason, and then we have Maelstrom Colossus for Cascade and Ulamog's Crusher for some removal. But you'll notice that most of our big creatures are at the 6 CMC mark, so that basically immediately we can play Imoti, and then we can start casting what is effectively 6/6s with Trample. We are running the OG Colossal Dreadmaw in this deck. So let's dive into the early game here. So what are we actually looking to do turns 1 through 3? And the answer to that is simply ramp. This is going to be your classic Simic ramp package. First, we're running Coiling Oracle to help put cards into our hands if we are not able to ramp the land out. Classic Cultivate is going to allow us to just keep advancing resources onto the board and into our hand. Eureka Moment doubles as card draw. In normal EDH, this this would be too inefficient for its effect, but I find that just being able to draw 2 cards and play an extra land is definitely worth 4 mana, and it is especially an instant so that we can bluff a particular counter spell if we're holding one. One other thing I'll mention too before I get too far is that one of the considerations for this deck building process was that we want to be able to cascade into these spells. So we're running 3 counter spells, which we don't want to cascade into, and ironically the first game I actually played with this deck, I cascaded into an Arcane Denial, which I could have countered my own commander to draw 3 cards, weirdly enough. But you'll notice that as we go through, a lot of these cards are meant to be played off of the free cascade trigger, such that we don't have to worry about things that interact with the stack as much. Farhaven Elf is going to help us ramp out a land. Elysian Caryatid is a mana dork that can tap for 2 mana later in the game. Kodama's Reach, similar to Cultivate. Overgrowth is a nice 3 mana ramp piece that can add green. So essentially this is a 3 mana ramp for 2, because if you attach it to a land the turn it comes down, you can actually use that mana right away. So it's a nice, there's no loss of tempo there. Steve is just great again for helping us ramp into 4 mana on turn 3. Skyshroud Claim can get us up to Imoti level mana so that we have 6 mana next turn. Springloom Druid, it allows us to fix our color by grabbing both lands of each basic land type. Utopia Sprawl, that 1 mana ramp. Wild Growth for more 1 mana ramp. In Utopia Sprawl, we don't actually have an issue attaching it to forest just because we're so heavy on forests in this deck. In fact, I believe we're running 14 forests in addition to 1 or 2 typed non-basic lands as well. And then we have Wood Elves to round it out for a slight reduction in tempo loss because it puts the forest into play untapped. Now, the key here is that when we look at a ramp package, there is a diverse set of ramp pieces across the mana curve so that we can actually consistently ramp on turns 1 through 3. So Cultivate, for example, if we play Utopia Sprawl turn 1 and then next turn we're able to Cultivate, we then have enough, a guaranteed mana to cast Imoti next turn to get us up to that 5 mana, but it really is not that big of a deal if we don't have a 1 mana ramp piece because there's only 2 in the deck. So then we cast a Steve, for example, on turn 2, ramp it into a Skyshroud Claim that also gets us to Imoti level mana. And if we, for example, don't want to run out Imoti right away, being at 6 mana on turn, let's see, that would be turn 4, is not bad either because we can cast a 6-drop to maybe bait out some removal as well. So when we take a look at the ramp package, it's across the different mana curves between 1 and 4, so that we always sort of have a game plan to get up to 5 and 6 mana. Then let's take a look at the meat and potatoes of the deck. What are we actually looking to cast? So we'll go through our fatty package here, as I like to call it. Anode Altasaur, one of my favorites because it is essentially a 6 mana body. You can get a, let's see, I actually have, I think one of the creatures in here is very similar to this. Timberland Ancient, you'll see, is a reach trample 6/5 body for 6 with forest cycling. Now, if you take away the forest cycling, you're left with a 6 mana 6/5 body with reach and trample, and Annoyed Altasaur is that, but for only 1 more mana, we get to cascade off of it. So again, just embodying these big bodies that generate us more card advantage and more mana advantage as we continue into the late game, and it really ensures that every card we draw in the late game is extra impactful, because if we're able to cascade into more ramp or even more an actual body that costs 5, such as Crash of Rhino Beetles, then that is just excellent for our game plan, and we're just looking to generate as much power and toughness as quickly as we can. Bramble of Behemoth is a 6 mana 6/6 with trample, basically just a Colossal Dreadmaw, and so this deck is really just built around 6/6s with trample. baby. So, you know, there's just nothing better than having that giant 6/6 sitting on the board. And yeah, there's nothing much else you can ask for there. Cavern Stomper is a new card from Lost Caverns. It's a 6 mana 7/7. Now, it doesn't have trample, but it does give us a little bit of card selection by ETBing and scrying 2. And then it does have a little bit of evasion if we pay for 4 to allow it to not be blocked by creatures with a power 2 or less. So this is one where you'll probably want to hold up that mana to swing with it. There's not a lot of things we have that can give it trample. There's a couple of ways to give it flying in this deck, but this is going to be a generic body that we're going to use for the stats, the fixing, and then we have to pay a little bit of extra to make it actually swing in for some evasive damage. Shardolin Dragon is a 6 mana 4/4 with flying. One of the weaknesses of this deck that I found out is that there is not as much defensiveness for flyers, and so I wanted to include some big flyers that will help us defend against any aerial assaults. And so Shardolin Dragon is one of those cards where it's not locked behind a color. The stats are not great. It's a 4/4 for 6 mana with flying, but it does give us that extra bit of defense in order to diversify our blocks. Colossal Dreadmask is a new card from Modern Horizons 3, which is basically Colossal Dreadmaw because it creates a germ and it attaches to the germ, and the equipped creature gets +6/+6 and trample. And then if we want to send that damage, let's say the germ has died from combat, we can then reuse the mask by equipping it for 5 to give something +6/+6 and trample, which is arguably better in my opinion, because then you can actually use it almost as a hasty sort of damage that you can immediately swing for 6 trample damage by paying only 5. So it's almost better once the germ has perished that you're able to reuse it. Then we've got the OG Colossal Dreadmaw, just a classic 6/6 with trample. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because this fella is just the best card in our deck, hands down. Then we move on to Crash of Rhino Beetles. It's a 5 mana 5/5 with trample, and because we're ramping so much, there's actually a decent chance that we enable its second ability, which is to give it +10/+10 as long as we control 10 or more lands. So that is just an excellent stat line. The caveat here is that it's not 6 mana, so it won't trigger our cascade abilities off of Imoti, but it is nonetheless something that we aspire to play as a Timmy player. Nothing would make me happier than to have a 15/15 trample on the battlefield. Greater Sandworm is another card that I already mentioned. It is not 6 mana, it is 7 mana, so we're a little bit behind on the 6 CMC curve. However, it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, and it also has cycling to really smooth out our early games. So one of the things that's kind of annoying when you're playing ramp decks is that you don't draw your ramp, and so one of the ways that you can mitigate that is just by playing a diverse set of monsters that allow you to toss them aside to grab something else via the cycling ability if you don't need it. Greater Tanuki, similar concept here, 6 mana 6/5 with trample, and we can pay 3 and discard it via its channel ability to ramp out a basic land, put it on the battlefield tapped. So it's below rate, but again, it is a good emergency button if we're not hitting our ramp. Then we move on to Hooting Mandrills, which is a 6 mana 4/4 with delve and trample. Now within this deck, I tried to include as many cards as I could that actually has a cost reduction built in, so that if we were, for example, able to delve, let's say 4 cards out of our graveyard to allow Hooting Mandrills to cost 2, we could actually, with Imoti on the battlefield, multi-spell, and then we would be able to cast, get 2 cascades if we were able to cast 2 creatures with our available mana. So if we have, like, I don't know, 8 mana available, we can cast the Hooting Mandrills for 2 and then another 6-drop to get even more value and really flood the board with a lot of power and toughness. So the cards that don't actually cost 6 are definitely a golden goose within the deck. There's not that many, and so when you draw it, these are definitely some of the better selections to have in hand. Maelstrom Colossus, 8 mana 7/7 with Cascade. Now the Ideal scenario with Maelstrom Colossus would be to cascade into another 6-drop that can, generate more stats, because Maelstrom Colossus does not have trample, so it's more effective kind of as a blocker. If your creatures don't have evasion, it's very hard for them to get through stalled board states. So the hope would be that we can cascade into a creature that does have trample, and then we have just a nicely statted blocker for us. And then we have Siege Worm, so 7 mana 5/5 with Convoke and Trample. Now our creatures can help cast this, so again, the goal would be to tap at least one creature, or even Imoti herself. We're pretty much never going to be sending Imoti into combat or even blocking, because she's just too fragile. So the ideal scenario would be to tap Imoti for the mana, and then Siege Worm will cost effectively 6. Now we do get a below rate body at a 5/5 trample, so I think ideally we'd like to tap 2 creatures if we have something like a Coiling Oracle sitting on the battlefield. But given the limited count of creatures we have that are CMC 4 or less that are creatures in the deck, it's not as likely, and so I think the assumption is that this will cost 6 with the potential to be reduced even further. Skysiphon Golfer, 6 mana 6/5 with Reach and Trample, and it can't be blocked by creatures with flying, so just some extra flying hate there. Striped Riverwinder is another card that, it costs 7 and it doesn't have Trample. However, it is a little bit unique in that it has Hexproof on a 5/5 body, and you can cycle it for only 1 blue. So this is just actually great to have in our opening hand. It's useful pretty much at any point in the game, because we are happy to spend an extra mana that we have laying around to cycle it if we don't need the Hexproof body. So again, a great pick here for some enduring power and toughness on the board. Timberline Ancient, 6 mana 6/5 Wreath Trample and 4 cycling 2. So good for the same reason as Striped Riverwinder. We can get rid of this in the early game, so it's always useful. Similar concept, Topiary Panther, 6/5 with Trample with basic land cycling, so we can color fix off of that. And then Ulamog's Crusher is just a Pauper EDH classic. It's an 8 mana 8/8 with Annihilator 2, and it attacks each combat if able. This is just, even if it doesn't have evasion, those Annihilator triggers can be devastating to the right deck. However, it is weak against the more go wide or artifact spammy type of decks. You could call them tchotchke decks if you're a Rachel Weeks follower. But I like to include this just as some extra bit of removal that we can help maintain on the board. All right, let's jump into then how do we refill our hand once we have all of these creatures deployed and or are looking for them if we are drawing ramp. So Azurfleet Admiral, I think, is a fantastic include in any PEDH deck with blue, because it essentially guarantees that you draw an extra card every single turn once it is played, because it is a 4 mana 3/3 pirate. When it ETBs, you become the monarch, immediately drawing us a card the turn it comes down. And then key here is Azurfleet Admiral can't be blocked by creatures the Monarch controls, meaning that you will always be able to get the Monarch back. So I love Azurfleet Admiral, always happy to see it in my hand, because it essentially just means I will be generating more card advantage than my opponents from there on out. Borrowing 100,000 arrows, draw a card for each tap creature target opponent controls for 3 mana. So this is pretty decent. I think in PEDH it seems like there are a lot more not necessarily go wide creature decks, but creatures are always an important part of a PEDH game because a lot more PEDH games revolve around combat if you're not going for infinite combos. So for a sort of casual PEDH game, this card will at least draw you 3 cards is sort of the minimum that I've seen. And then in a similar vein, I'll just jump to Theft of Dreams, which is the exact same text for the exact same mana costs, which is essentially a functional copy of Borrowing 100,000 Arrows. Then we have Canal Courier, 6 mana, key mana here. 3/5, when ETBs, you become the Monarch, and then similar to Zerfleet Admiral, it has the ability to not be blocked if it and another creature attack different players. So this, again, guarantees that you can always become the Monarch, and the Monarch is especially good in our deck because we have so many trample creatures that are evasive that can allow us to get damage through. And even if we don't have a trample creature on board, it is still able to attack with cards like our Firehaven Elf. If we have some, if we want to essentially, send in a card like a Wood Elves, we're happy to have that die in exchange for getting the Monarch, so that Canal Courier can be unblocked. So again, just a great 6-drop for the deck that generates card advantage. Flight of Fancy can draw us 2 cards as an aura for 4, and an enchanted creature has flying. So this is sort of a key piece that we might want to hold back if we have something like a, let's say, where's our Cavern Stomper here that doesn't have evasion, or our Ulamog's Crusher to give that flying. That would be absolutely devastating, or a Striped Riverwinder. So I figured, we want to be doing 2 things here when we are looking at our card advantage. Obviously, we want to be drawing cards in this category, but if we can combine some evasion into that as well, it makes our cards more powerful. And so if we cascade into this, we are happy, to give our creatures evasion and then draw some extra cards, so we can just keep playing more lands and more creatures. Keep Watch, another Pauper staple, great for go wide decks, but this deck I think would probably be more likely to use this on defense, because for 3 mana we can draw a card for each attacking creature at instant speed, and the key here is we probably want to save this for our opponent's turns. Not only can you bluff a counterspell off of this, but generally in PEDH, I find that, again, if you're not in that combo type of meta, people are swinging every turn to try to chip in some damage. If we also have the Monarch floating around, people are going to be swinging for that. And so Keep Watch, I've noticed, will draw at least 2 cards, and we can certainly draw those cards ourselves if we're in the late game and we've got a big 6/6 with Trample that can swing in for effectively free. Mull Drifter is going to essentially be a divination, but the reason why this is in over a different card that's a little bit cheaper to cast, that might be an instant or sorcery, is that if we cascade into this, we actually get a 2/2 flyer along with drawing those 2 cards. So just a great card to cascade into because we get to keep the body. Then we have Quick Study, which is a pretty vanilla draw spell. Honestly, you could probably swap this out with something else if you wanted to tinker with the deck a little bit. It's just a 3-mana draw 2 at instant speed, basically just a strictly better divination. There's an interesting card that I came across called Rooftop Nuisance, which is actually somewhat interesting. It's a 3-mana with Casualty 1, and it says tap target creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step, and then draw a card. So the only way that this is really good is if you do activate the Casualty to sack a creature with power 1 or greater to copy it. So it would essentially be a sorcery speed divination to draw 2, and then you would tap 2 target creatures so and then they don't untap during their controller's next untap step. And in exchange, you have to sacrifice a creature with power 1 or greater. Now, that's probably not best for this deck where we have a lot of high power and toughness creatures, but I'm just basically wanted to mention that because there are some options that you can employ. Quick Study is a little bit generic, and I just wanted a generic draw spell that will work every time. And again, with being instant speed, we are running 3 counter spells, so we can definitely bluff for a counter spell to make our opponents play around a potential counter spell. Rush of Knowledge is a 5-mana sorcery. Draw cards equal to the highest CMC among permanents you control, so that's going to be just great because we're running a lot of 6-mana cards, and generally this will allow you to draw either 5 or 6 cards, and then if you don't have the 6/6 trample on the field yet, you can cast this with Imoti on the field to draw 5. So draw 5 for 5 is pretty freaking great, and it can't be fizzled because it does not target. Secrets of the Golden City is some good tech that I like to employ for the late game. 3 mana with Ascend, which means you control 10 or more permanents. You get the City's Blessing. Draw 2 cards. If you have the City's Blessing, draw 3 cards instead. Most of the time, I think we'll say like 60% of the time, this is going to be a regular old divination. But because we are ramping so much, and a lot of our ramp is in the form of generating permanents onto the field, various creatures and so forth, it is actually pretty easy to get that Ascend trigger. So, 40 to 50% of the time, I think that this will actually be a draw 3 for 3, which I think is pretty good. Theft of Dreams, we already covered. We're running Treasure Cruise, a standard all-star back in the day. 8 mana with Delve to draw 3 cards. And this can sometimes be a little bit difficult to cast, but how I sort of do the math on this is that if I'm able to delve at least 4 cards out of my graveyard, I think it's worth it, because a 4 mana draw 3 sorcery I think is pretty decent in Pauper EDH. In regular Commander, it'd be not as good, but it's decent card advantage either way, and I think that is definitely doable once we have a couple of our mana dorks die in the early game, and or have some spells that we've cast to ramp, such as Skyshroud Claim, or if we've had our Eureka moment cast in the early game as well. Walk with the Ancestors is a 5 mana sorcery. Return up to 1 target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand, and then discover 4. So it's essentially for 1 mana, as I think about this. For 1 mana, we are returning 1 target permanent card from our graveyard to your hand. You can even maybe say 2. That would cost us 2 mana to put a card into our hand. And then for 3 mana, then the rest of the cost, we're discovering 4, which is basically Cascade, but we don't have to cast a spell if we don't want to. So it gets around counter spells. And so this is great because it's really just sort of card advantage and mana advantage stapled into one. It replaces itself in your hand, and it allows you to cheat that mana cost to continue to ramp or do whatever. And then Winding Way, because we are so creature heavy, let's actually read it first. Winding Way, 2 mana, choose creature or land, reveal the top 4 cards of your library, put all cards of the chosen type revealed this way into your hand, and the rest into your graveyard. So you might ask, how many creatures are we running? We are running 33 creatures, and what I like to do is also cast it for the land effect in the early game. It's really just never a dead card. So if we figure, let's just do the math here. So if we go 33 divided by 99 times 4, on average this will draw us about 1 creature, and then we have, I think, 35 actual lands. So this is 35 divided by 99 times 4. So 1.4 lands on average. So I think in general, this will, there's some upside here to draw 2 cards for 2 effectively. There's a little bit of upside of being able to mill those into the yard for possible delve purposes with Hooting Mandrills or our Treasure Cruise as well. So Winding Way, I mean, you're probably going to be drawing 1 off of it, but the key here is that you can choose either one, so it always will fix you for whatever you need. And I actually do run this in place of a land slot, even though that sounds kind of weird. Normally you would want to reserve a ramp as a replacement for your land slot, but I found that in creature heavy decks you can actually run Winding Way and be just fine. It's just a great fixer and helps the deck run smoothly. And then we're running 1 tutor piece here, Fierce Empath, to allow us to get any creature with CMC 6 or greater and put it into our hand. So we get sort of our pick of the field. For example, if we can turn on Crash of Rhino Beetles, well, actually, no, that's a 5 CMC, and my apologies, that would not qualify. If we have like our, I don't know, Flight of Fancy in hand to give something flying, then we might want to look at a Cavern Stomper, but maybe most of the time I think we're probably just going to grab an Ulamog's Crusher for that Annihilator ability. And then we've got a decent chunk of cards set aside here for removal. The purpose of having so many removal cards is that this deck really wants to delay to the late game. So it's by no means a control deck. However, I think it is good to have at least 2 removal spells that we can cast in between our ramping. So if we were to, I don't know, ramp into Imoti, or maybe we're not quite ready to cast Imoti because we want to follow up with a creature that we don't quite have yet. It's best to just be playing removal pieces to ensure that we can continue to play more lands and cast our big bodies. So here we have Aether Snipe, which actually counts as casting a 6 mana spell when we evoke it. So I'd say 99% of the time, we're going to be evoking this for 3 mana. When it ETBs, return a target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. So really just a bounce spell that's going to trigger Imoti. Aggressive Instinct, 2 mana sorcery. I run a lot of bite spells. I find that fighting in Commander and PEDH is just not as good as bite spells. So I'd rather, either way, you're still opening yourself up to having the spell fizzle by targeting your own creatures, but to not actually put your creature at risk is pretty good by removing the fighting portion of it. So Aggressive Instinct is sort of your baseline bite spell. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control for 2 mana. That's sort of the going rate. Arcane Denial is just a great counterspell, arguably one of the best in Pauper EDH because it replaces itself. Bite Down is going to be another bite spell at instant speed, so better than Aggressive Instinct. Again, that's sort of the baseline. So here we have an instant speed bite. Bite Down on Crime is from the recently released Murders at Karlov Manor, although recently, I guess it was like 6 months ago. But this is most of the time going to be cast for 2 mana because we can collect Evidence 6, which means exile cards with total mana value 6 or greater from your graveyard. All we need is 1 creature to meet that condition. And then this spell costs 2 less to cast is if evidence was collected. Target creature in control gets +2/+0 until end of turn and bites another target creature. So a little bit of a power buff there. And again, if we cascade into this, we're happy to cast it either way, even if we don't collect that evidence. Cosmic Hunger is an instant speed bite spell, although we can hit planeswalkers and battles, which I don't think is relevant in PEDH. I actually don't know if there are planeswalkers in the format. Relatively new to the format. I'm almost positive they're either uncommon, rare, or mythic, but I'll have to put an annotation on the screen if I'm wrong about that. Your classic counterspell, Forceful Denial, which is going to allow us to cascade. Forceful Denial can definitely be slotted, or rather replaced with a different counterspell if you want to be a little bit more efficient. I believe like Dispel, if we look up Dispel, I think that's the counter target instant spell. This can definitely be slotted right in instead. The reason why is that we're running this instead is that if we happen to cascade into it off of Imoti, we can actually continue the cascade, so it's not a brick off of a cascade trigger. And also because while 5 mana is a lot to hold up, we can treat, I just like how this makes the card more effective in the late game. Instead of just simply countering a spell, we get something as well. So by sort of making our cards very dense in terms of the effects that they generate for us, we can have a much stronger late game by having our cards that we draw be more impactful. So if we kind of think about this as 2 mana to counter target spell, we're getting a 3 mana cascade at the 5 CMC level, which I think is definitely worth it. The caveat being that we have to hold up 5, but again, if we have if we're not ready to cast Imoti yet, or maybe we're protecting our Imoti, I think this is great to hold up. Gift of the Viper is a new card from Modern Horizons 3, 1 mana instant. Put a +1/+1 counter, a reach counter, and a death touch counter on to target creature and untap it. So this essentially allows us to get a little bit more flying defense, but it effectively reads as destroy target attacking creature because we can surprise untap a tapped tapped creature, and also just really make our opponents think that we are completely tapped out, and again, just destroy target attacking creature. So just a great efficient spell for only 1 mana. Asperia's Skywatch is a card that I've considered replacing. It is a 6 mana 3/3 flyer. When it ETBs, detain target creature and opponent controls, which means until your next turn, that creature can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. I wanted to include a little bit more removal in our creature package here at the 6 CMC level. I just don't know if detain is quite worth it. To be honest, I included this to diversify my removal a little bit in case there is perhaps a creature with an ETB that we don't want to bounce, or a creature with a particularly powerful activated ability. But I figured that it's not always good to be bouncing creatures. I believe there is a 6 mana creature that does the same thing, but it is also a flyer, so it gives us a little bit of flying defense. So you could definitely swap this with your favorite 6 CMC creature of your choosing. However, I have it in here just to diversify the removal package a little bit. Master's Rebuke, 2 mana bite spell, once again, nothing special there. Myconid Spore Tender, 4 mana 4/1, ETBs destroy target artifact or enchantment. Natural Reclamation, 5 mana Cascade, destroy target artifact or enchantment. So again, here, sort of similar thinking here as Forceful Denial. Once we have the sort of more impactful cards condensed onto our removal, it just feels better, I think. And also the act of cascading itself is rather fun, which is why I include a lot of these cascade type of cards. But I think that still for 5 mana you are getting a good rate, because if we figure that a naturalized effect costs around 2 to destroy target artifact enchantment, we're getting a 3 mana cascade at the 5 CMC level, which I think is perfectly acceptable. Oceanus Dragon, another 6 mana 3/5 beater with flying. When it ETBs, tap target creature and opponent controls and goad it. So again, diversifying our removal a little bit to be good against decks that might have large creatures like ourselves. Pick your poison, 1 mana sorcery, choose one. Each opponent sacks an artifact, or each opponent sacks an enchantment, or each opponent sacks a creature with flying. This can really just be catered to whatever you need for only 1 mana, which I think it is why it is so effective. Ram Through is another bite spell, and if the creature has trample, excess damage is dealt to that creature's controller, so there's a little bit of extra burn stapled to this. Voracious Varmint can help us destroy target artifact or enchantment for effectively 3 mana, and again, this is one of those key sort of decisions here where if we have it sitting on the battlefield off of a free cascade trigger, later on we can save the actual destroy effect for when we need it instead of just destroying something right away. Wickerbow Elder, 4 mana 4/4, ETBs with a -1/-1 counter, and then we can remove that -1/-1 counter by paying 1 mana to destroy target artifact or enchantment. So it becomes a 5/5 essentially once we have paid a total of 5 mana into it, which is perfectly acceptable and a great source of removal. So that is basically all of the cards. I'll just take a quick spin through the mana banks here. Command Tower is going to be our free land. Conduit Pylons can help us card fix. Crystal Grotto, Scry 1, a little bit more fixing there. 14 Forest. Generous Ent is in a land slot because it has Forest Cycling 1, and it is again, 6 mana, 5/7 with reach, which is a perfectly acceptable body, and it will get us that food token if we don't need that land in the late game. We have 10 islands, a couple of cycling lands here in case we are flooded. I never mind paying 1 to cycle a land, because essentially a tapped land is paying 1 to have the land enter tapped anyway. So, just happy to draw that card if we are flooded. Lorien Revealed, just an unbelievable common. I cannot believe this was even printed in Lord of the Rings, but we can draw 3 cards for 5, or essentially run it as a tapped land because it has Island Cycling 1. Lush Oasis can help color fix us, and it deals 1 damage to target opponent. So this is one of our tapped lands, but it taps for both colors of mana. Path of Ancestry, again, it will get us that Scry trigger off of casting our commander, and I believe we don't have, we have one druid, two druids, I think a Nos, 3 druids. I don't think Naga counts as, so we have 3 druids, I guess, that can trigger Path of Ancestry, but I really, really this is just for the mana fixing, and we'll probably just be, have one scry trigger off of our commander being cast. Ramwood Falls is searchable. Simic Growth Chamber can draw us a land, and it's a tap land essentially. Tangled Islet, again, is searchable. Thornwood Falls gain us a life. Tranquil Thicket, we can cycle. The only other shout out I wanted to give for this deck that you could consider including is, which I don't have it in here, let's actually pull up Rancor. This is actually a Pauper legal, even though it has the uncommon coloring here. Rancor is a 1 mana aura that gives enchanted creature +2/+2 and has trample, but when it is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return it to its owner's hand. So it's a reusable +2/+0 with trample. I do like Rancor as a card. I just think that we already have a lot of cards that have trample, and so I don't think it's as valuable as something that, you know, another sort of build where you're not running as much trample. Let's see, was there anything else here I wanted to mention? I think the deck is a little bit short of life gain. I think that it's usually good to run 1 or 2 sources of life gain. And one of the sort of maybes that I've always kept in the maybe board here, prototype cards, actually when you cast them for their prototype cost, count as that cost. So you don't actually get the cascade, for example, if you were to prototype out Boulder Branch Golem. Otherwise, these would definitely be shoo-ins. But there are a couple of other cards that I'll just maybe mention really quick here. So Cactarantula is from Lost Caverns of Ixalan, and it can cost 5 if we control a desert. However, it doesn't have trample, so I'm not running that, even though it is a little bit undercosted for its stats. There is Finclade Fugitives, has a little bit of evasion on a bigger body, but it only has 4 toughness, and the Encore, I will say, is pretty nice, but the problem is if an opponent has a 4/4, you're totally screwed with Finclade Fugitives, which is why we really wanted to run more of the 6/6s with trample, and then I think there. Let's see, Spined Megalodon was a consideration to have that hexproof, and it has a little bit of the card selection. Thundersteel Colossus was also a consideration because it is effectively a 7/7 trample with haste, because we would probably crew it with Imoti. However, I don't know. It still is a strong maybe, if I'm being honest, because it would trigger Imoti, giving any spells we control or any spells we cast with CMC 6 or greater Cascade. I do like Thundersteel Colossus quite a bit because it's just a hasty 7/7 damage. And then one of the other cards, Undercover Crocodile, can give you a little bit of card advantage, but it has to deal combat damage. And then I think this is more of a buffer type of effect. So that is the deck, everybody. I will be goldfishing this in a future companion video, but I can tell you with confidence that Imoti is an absolute blast to play because the very active cascading is very fun. I just love that action of, all right, folks, let's see what we're gonna, flip from the top here. And everybody, tunes in because you never know what will come off of the top of the deck. So that is Imoti Celebrant of Bounty PEDH deck. Again, if you like the video, please leave a like on it. If you like this sort of content, please subscribe. Again, I'll have a companion video where we will goldfish this and try to see how fast we can power out our 6/6s. So that's the video, guys. Thank you all for watching once again, and hopefully I will see you all in the next one.